colleagues who recommended me for this opportunity, but I am not a scripture expert, and I have no formal theological training. In fact, I probably fit the stereotype of the Catholic who doesn't know the Bible very well. But I've come to understand and better appreciate my faith for its teachings on service and justice and love of neighbor. So I'll be speaking from my head and my heart this afternoon. In the Christian tradition, we're familiar with many sets of rules and guidelines for how to live a holy life. When thinking back on my religious formation growing up, there was a great deal of emphasis on memorizing rules and practices like the Ten Commandments, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And for quite a while, that's all that my faith meant to me. It was a bunch of things I had to do or things I was forbidden to do for reasons I rarely understood. As I grew older and began to grow in my faith and explore what it means to love my neighbor, my faith became a lot more to me than that. In the book of Romans, the Apostle Paul references the Ten Commandments to help us distinguish between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, which is love. Owe no one anything except to love one another, for he who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet, and if there is any other commandment, are all summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Before Jesus, the Jewish people tended to get caught up in the technicalities of some of these laws, especially the ones that existed to bring order to religion, often through ritual and daily habits. So it was natural that elders and religious leaders grew suspicious of Jesus and his followers, who preached about this one law, love. So in the Bible, we hear about a scribe who asked Jesus, which commandment is the first of all, the most important? And Jesus answers him saying, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The first verse is from Deuteronomy and the second from Leviticus, both of which would have been familiar to the Jews of the day given their prominence in the Old Testament. I won't go into too much detail here because I don't want to steal any thunder from my Jewish friend over here. But the most important thing to note here is that Jesus put the two verses together for a reason. And that was to emphasize that there is no distinction between loving God and loving neighbor. They are deeply intertwined and each sustains the other. The Christian life is marked by a focus on God and on our neighbors. The more we love God, the more we learn to love our neighbors. And the more we love our neighbors, the more we become like Christ. We get closer to God with each act of love, and each act of love brings someone else closer to God as well. All God wants from us is to love God and to love our neighbor. Stripped of all the theological debates and boiled down to its raw essence, this is the basis on which Christians will be judged. In reflection on this gospel passage last year, Pope Francis proclaimed, Mark the Evangelist, the credited author of this text, does not bother to specify who the neighbor is, because a neighbor is a person whom I meet on the journey, in my days. It is not a matter of pre-selecting my neighbor, for that is not Christian. I think my neighbor is the one I have chosen ahead of time, but no, this is not Christian. It is about having eyes to see and a heart to want what is good for him or her. This challenges our Christian communities. It means avoiding the risk of being communities that have many initiatives, but few relationships. The risk of being community service stations, but with little company, in the full and Christian sense of this term. So now that we know why it's important to love our neighbor, let's talk about how we define neighbor. According to Pope Francis, as I just read, a neighbor is anyone we encounter in our daily lives on the journey. But Matthew, another gospel author, is more specific. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. In this case, our neighbor is our enemy, which sounds noble in theory, but what does it look like in practice? So to answer this question, I'm going to guide us through one of the most famous stories from the New Testament. Many of you may be familiar with the parable of the Good Samaritan. Jesus often simplified the profound spiritual truths he needed to share with his followers in the form of relatable stories that were easy to understand. Called parables, these stories appear in our Gospels. So let's start by setting the stage. Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Again, as a side note, these religious leaders had made almost an art form of classifying all the various laws and giving them degrees of importance. So in asking Jesus this question, their aim was to test him a bit. Jesus responded, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" The lawyer answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, the lawyer asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Here he's trying to get off on a technicality, to have Jesus define neighbor in the expected way, which would set limits on the obligation to help. So as I continue the story, I want you to keep in mind two questions. One is, what does it look like to love someone? How far would you go for someone in need? And two, is anyone off limits? Are there any boundaries to who we treat lovingly? And we'll get the answers to these questions through this story. So Jesus responded with the parable of the Good Samaritan. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down the road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 coins and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back." So Jesus asked, which of these 3, do you think, proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? And the lawyer said, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "You go and do likewise." So one characteristic of parables is that they tend to interrupt the status quo or catch us off guard in some way. In order to understand what Jesus is trying to communicate here, we need a little more information about the social and historical context. So key things to note here. First is that the ones who should have helped didn't. We're not told why the priest and the Levite, both religious leaders, walked right by. Perhaps they thought they were engaged in important religious work and thus not responsible for the injured man. And in fact, if the injured man had been a non-Jew, or if he were already dead, they could have risked defilement, which would have had serious consequences for their jobs and reputations. Perhaps they were afraid that the thieves were still close by and they would have been in danger. Maybe they were just in a hurry and thought they didn't have time. Whatever the reason, these were considered good, righteous people, and they should have been the ones to stop and help. Instead, they left a man bleeding and badly injured and went on their way. The second point is that the one who had every reason to ignore the man in need is the one who stopped to help. Back in this day and age, Good Samaritan would have been an oxymoron. Animosity existed between Jews and Samaritans because of decades, hundreds of years of historical and religious differences. In the parable, though, the victim is helped not by good people or religious people, but by a man nobody in the audience would have liked, a man who was meant to be the enemy. So how do we summarize the lessons this parable teaches us about how to love our neighbor? And how can we apply these in our own lives? I'm going to offer you 3 lessons this afternoon. The first is to see the neighbor, to free ourselves of judgment and prejudice, to look past the obvious, the outer shell, how people appear, into their eyes, their hearts, their suffering, and their circumstances, recognizing and prioritizing their human dignity above all else. As we heard in the story, the Samaritan saw the man on the side of the road and responded. Sometimes we choose not to notice, especially when it's inconvenient, uncomfortable, expensive, at personal risk to ourselves. But like Jesus and the Samaritan, we are called to go to the margins, to the lost, the outcast, and the needy. The second lesson is to be compassionate. A heart that's moved by compassion cannot sit idly by while someone suffers a need. Loving your neighbor as yourself is being moved to help to the fullest extent of your ability. In 1 Corinthians, we hear that no one should seek their own good, but the good of others. We measure our every action and our every choice by whether it harms another or promotes their well-being. In a speech shortly before he died, Martin Luther King Jr. referenced the Good Samaritan parable. And he said, and so the first question that the priest asked, the first question that the Levite asked, was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But then the Good Samaritan came by, and he reversed the question. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? The third lesson here is to take action. The Good Samaritan responded to what he saw. He didn't just feel a pang of guilt or pity for the man on the side of the road and continue on his way. He stopped to do something about it. The Gospel of John tells us, "Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth." Love is made visible by carrying out the severe demands required by it. And I want to highlight a few ways that contemporary Christians and Catholics are taught to answer this call to act. The first is to act through accompaniment, by walking alongside our neighbors, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, as they find their way, to share their joy and suffering. Love is a communal effort when done properly. The Samaritan did what he could, but then entrusted the man in need to the innkeeper, who could provide additional care. The second way to act is through charity, which is addressing symptoms of an issue or a need by providing emergency assistance or direct aid. This is what the Samaritan did when he tended to the man's wounds, secured shelter, and arranged for his care. The third is justice, which addresses the root causes of an issue or a need by working to change the policies, practices, or systems that contribute to it and perpetuate it. The Samaritan, and even the priest and the Levite, could have done this by starting a conversation in the next village about how to make the road to Jericho safer, so that fewer travelers would fall victim to robbers in the first place. In this story, Jesus demonstrates that our neighbors are especially those people who ignore us, those people who separate themselves from us, who are afraid of us, those we have the most difficulty loving, and those we feel don't love us back. These are our neighbors. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, "If you love those who love you, what reward will you get?" Anybody can do that. When we think of neighbor today, we often think of physical proximity. Who are the people that live on our streets, the people we see at work every day, the people we spend the most time with? But Jesus calls us to spiritual proximity. Who do we choose to stand with? And who do we choose to stand with despite concerns over reputation, time constraints, financial costs, physical danger, even the laws on the books? I want to share with you what could be considered a modern retelling of this story from the life of Mother Teresa, who is now a saint in the Catholic Church, who was a sister who spent most of her time with the poorest of the poor in India. So as the story goes, one day, Mother Teresa took in a woman off the streets of Calcutta. Her body was a mess of open sores infested with bugs. Mother Teresa patiently bathed her, cleaning and dressing her wounds. But the woman never stopped shrieking insults and threats at her. Mother Teresa only smiled. Finally, the woman snarled, "Sister, why are you doing this? Not everyone behaves like you. Who taught you?" She replied simply, "My God taught me." When the woman asked who this God was, Mother Teresa kissed her on the forehead and said, "You know my God. My God is called love." We don't have parables for every circumstance we may run into, and we're seeing this more and more with advances in medicine, technology, and economics, and as moral issues continue to be at the forefront of national discourse. Luckily, we've been provided with a framework for discerning when and how to respond to the suffering of our neighbors. And this is one of my favorite parts of being Catholic, one of the pieces I'm most proud of, and it's called Catholic Social Teaching. Derived from scripture and tradition, as well as more modern documents written by popes and councils and bishops. Depending on who you ask, you might hear that there are 7 principles or 10 principles or somewhere in between. They've been condensed and expanded and reframed over the years, but I'm going to stick with 7 for the sake of time and because that's the version taught by the U.S. bishops. Number 1 is respect for life and dignity of the human person. No matter who we fear or hate, because of what they look like, the part of the world they're from, the language they speak, the religion they profess, they are made in the image and likeness of God, and Jesus died on the cross with them in mind. Number 2 is the call to family, community, and participation. The human person is not only sacred, but social. How we organize our society in economics and politics, in law and policy, directly affects human dignity and the capacity of individuals to grow in community and participate in the decisions that affect their lives and families. Number 3 is rights and responsibilities. Every person has a fundamental right to life and a right to those things required for a decent life. Corresponding to these rights are duties and responsibilities to one another, to our families, and to the larger society. Number 4 is preferential option for the poor and vulnerable, which doesn't mean an option, it means the only option. A basic moral test is how our most vulnerable members are faring. In a society marred by deepening divisions between rich and poor, we are instructed to put the needs of the poor and vulnerable first. Number 5 is the dignity of work and the rights of workers. The economy must serve people, not the other way around. Work is more than a way to make a living. It is a form of continued participation in God's creation. Number 6 is solidarity. We are one human family, whatever our national, racial, ethnic, economic, and ideological differences. We are our brothers and sisters keepers, wherever they may be. And number 7 is care for God's creation. We show our respect for the Creator by our stewardship of creation and neighbor. We are called to protect people and the planet, living our faith in relationship with all of God's creation. I joke with colleagues that if I leave an event with people feeling pleased and complacent rather than a little challenged and uncomfortable, I haven't done my job. And I don't believe that any of you are here purely for intellectual purposes. You're here because you care deeply about others and seek wisdom that might help you to make sense of the crazy world around us. So without getting political, I want to leave you with some closing thoughts. It shouldn't take much imagination for each of us to figure out who Jesus would use as an example of neighbor in a retelling of the Good Samaritan parable in our own time and place. For an Israeli, how about a Palestinian? For a Christian, how about a Muslim or a Jew? For a rich white person, how about a black welfare mother? For a black male, how about a city cop? For a Democrat, how about a Republican? For a suburban white family, how about the undocumented family that moved in down the street? For all of us, how about those we perceive as unmotivated, undisciplined, uneducated, or undeserving? Who would Jesus use as the neighbor if he were speaking to you? And how would you respond in a compassionate, proactive, neighborly way? So as we all leave here today, I challenge you to examine your own heart, to seek out these people, then answer Jesus' call to go and do likewise. And I promise to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just want to remind everybody about these wires down here, so nobody trips over them. I almost got my cane caught on it before, so have to remember those wires. Our next speaker is Rabbi Dr. Joseph. Rabbi worked full-time at the Jewish Child and Family Services since 2005, and he presently serves as a Rabbinic counselor and Jewish Chaplaincy Services Chaplain. We welcome you, Rabbi. And also pull the lectern down.
Thank you, Sister. At times like this, I'm often reminded of a story. I know the Jewish version of the story. There is probably a Christian version of this story, and there may even be a Muslim version of the story, but I'm most familiar with the Jewish version of the story. Two people sitting on a plane traveling somewhere, and one of them clearly looks like the rabbi part. And the gentleman sitting next to him says, "You must be a rabbi, right?" The man says, "Yes, I'm a rabbi." And the other man says, "Well, you know, Rabbi, I don't know much about religion. I don't know much about faith or spirituality. But the one thing I can tell you is that all of religion and all of faith and all of spirituality can be boiled down to a very simple phrase: love your neighbor as yourself. So the rabbi doesn't have much of a comment. What's he going to say? Sure. He says to the man, "Tell me, sir, what do you do for a living?" The man says, "Well, me, I'm an astrophysicist." So the rabbi thinks for a minute and says, "Well, sir, I don't know much about astronomy and I don't know much about physics, but I can tell you this: all astronomy and all of physics can be boiled down to one simple phrase: twinkle, twinkle, little star." This, of course, is the burden with which we come today, trying to boil down one of the most profound comments and themes in all faiths to a 20-plus minute presentation, with time for questions, of course, which we will have, of course. I'm supposed to be giving the Jewish perspective, and I'm going to be doing that with a couple of stories and anecdotes of my own as well. Part of my background, which is alluded to a little bit, is besides being ordained as an Orthodox rabbi, my bachelor's degree was at Loyola. Yes, go Ramblers. And I did my doctorate at a good Protestant divinity school, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, UCC school. I haven't had the pleasure or privilege of studying in a Muslim institution, madrasa, or anything like that yet. But at some point, I hope to get there. Part of the fun in my job in working for Jewish Child and Family Services and in professional chaplaincy is I have a lot of fun sorting out that background and figuring out which resources am I going to use depending on who I'm trying to help and who I'm serving and where I am. What I'm going to try to do in the few minutes that I have is go to the source in the Torah, in the Hebrew Scriptures. We don't like to use the term Old Testament. The Hebrew Scriptures, the Torah, for the term of loving your neighbor. And I'm going to do something I wasn't planning on doing, but I feel moved to make this comment. I'm not the one to comment on my colleagues' presentations because they're the experts in their faiths. But I do want to point out, and I'm going to raise a little spark here, to disagree with one point Liz said. I'm in agreement with most of her conclusions, but I would disagree with the point, which is kind of colored by the New Testament, suggesting that the Jews before the time of Jesus were tied up in ritual and law and things like that. There's a lot of scholarship going on right now, which you can access. It's being published, it's out there, it's online, about the very complex picture of religion and specifically the Jewish community in the Middle East in the first century, which was the crucible from which Judaism and specifically the Rabbinic tradition grew, from which the church grew, and eventually, several centuries later, Islam as well, in a different part of the Middle East. So I'm going to try to offer perhaps an alternate approach to that one point in the context of my remarks, because I think it paints us kind of like as the bad guys of that period, and those are my ancestors we're talking about. And if I'm sounding self-defensive, well, we're the minority here, okay? Here and in general in terms of the Jewish population of the world. So yeah, we do get a little bit defensive about that. I think we have the right to be. As Golda Meir once famously said, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not chasing after you. But what I wanted to really do is offer something positive and perhaps another approach which doesn't not match what my colleagues has had, but from a Jewish source, which I brought with me actually. I would say at its essence, Judaism is a text-based religion. The text is both the Torah, which you would call the Hebrew Scriptures, specifically the 5 books of Moses, and also the Rabbinic tradition, which was also called the Oral Torah, which is about several millennia of commentary on that written tradition. I'm going to introduce you to some of that in the few minutes that I have as well. The verse in question is Leviticus. It's chapter 19, verse 18. It's from a section of Leviticus often known as the Holiness Code. And essentially it tells us how to build a holy society. And much of it is actually not based in ritual. Some of it is, I would say, but a lot of it's based in communal rules and guidelines and regulations for how to build a holy society. And the context is important here. It says in verse 17, I'm going to read the English, "You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall reprove your fellow, and do not bear a sin because of him. In other words, if you have a problem, you have to say something. You shall not take revenge, nor shall you bear a grudge against the members of your people. And you shall love your neighbor, here it's translated as your fellow, as yourself. I am God. So there's a context here I think that's important. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but clearly the idea of loving your neighbor, loving your fellow, recha could be in Hebrew, the Hebrew is v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, which is 3 words in Hebrew. You shall love your neighbor or friend as yourself. I'm going to focus on those 3 words as my presentation today. And clearly it's in the context of how we get along with each other, which is the core of Leviticus, which is the core of this holiness code that we are suggesting right here. And then it says, I am God. Why do we have to say, I am God? I am God, that phrase comes throughout this entire chapter 19, throughout all the other issues of dealing with how we treat working people and how we treat the elderly, and there's some religious law, and God keeps saying, I'm God, I'm God. Why I am God? We don't know this. To quote the great rabbinic sage Chevy Chase, in the early years of Saturday Night Live, I'm God and you're not. That's kind of what God is saying here, to remember, we're creations of God. But there may be another piece to this. In the Talmud, that great repository of rabbinic tradition, the great Rabbi Akiva, 1st century rabbi, lived a little bit after Jesus did. He was tortured and martyred by the Romans somewhere in the 2nd century, early 2nd century, the 130s, let's say. He was quoted as saying that the words, loving your neighbor as yourself, this is the organizing principle, the general principle of the Torah. The word is klal gadol, major principle. So that might be the axis upon which everything revolves, and Liz actually alluded to that in the New Testament sense. Although, in typical Jewish fashion, there was another rabbi who disagreed with him and said, no, that's not the organizing principle. He said the organizing principle is Genesis chapter 1, that the first human being was created in the image of God. That's the organizing principle. Now, I suppose in some sense they both get us to the same place. That if we need to relate to each other, if we need to care for each other, then we need a religious source, at least for Jews in Jewish tradition, to tell us why that is. One, this might be just saying, God is saying, love your neighbor as yourself, and I'm going to define that a little bit more in just a moment. But there may be some limitations on that, to which the other source about all of us being created in God's image does not have the same limitations. And that might be a better organizing principle about why we need to care for and relate to each other. So we'll hold that. I'll just see how much time I have, okay? So let's take a look at this verse, and I'm going to introduce you to some of the great Jewish scholars who actually interpreted this verse, and I think they have some lessons to teach us with some very modern themes, and they each have to do with parsing one of the 3 words in the key phrase, love your neighbor as yourself. So what do these words actually mean? Okay, let me parse the 3rd word first, as yourself. The great sage Nachmanides, the Ramban, he lived in 11th and 12th century Spain, and he was actually exiled from Spain due to persecution of Jews by the church at that time. But he wrote one of the great commentaries of the Torah. He said the word kamocha, the 3rd word, which is as yourself, meaning you should love your neighbor the way you would love yourself. This is interpretation, which puts kind of a psychological twist on it, but a very, very good one, because it adds the element of self-esteem. That part of the ability to reach out to others is that you got to be friends with yourself. You have to care for yourself in the process. And the fact is, we often know that people who are violent, people who have difficulty with others, who hate others, often underneath hate themselves. They have problems with themselves as well. So that is one limitation on it by parsing that particular that third word in the process. I was in Pittsburgh last year. I spent 5 days in Pittsburgh as a chaplain. I was invited there by their Jewish Federation to offer spiritual support to the Jewish community there after the shootings, the attacks there. And in fact, I'm going back there in a few weeks for the year anniversary. They asked me to come and do some teaching there in that. And I heard some amazing stories when I was there. One of which is that the shooter actually might have fit this psychological profile. The person hated everybody, was willing to play out his hate in violence, which meant he didn't have a very good self-conception of himself. I'm going to come back to that actually in a few minutes. Now, let's take a look at one of the other words here as well. Okay? The word is neighbor, re'acha, the second word. Neighbor or friend would be an accurate translation of the Hebrew as well. To love your neighbor, love your friend. And the question then becomes, as Liz suggested, who's your friend? And again, there are different commentaries on this as well, but the majority approach is that pretty much everybody, whoever is near you. But there's an interesting limitation, and this is again the Rashbam, who is an 11th century French commentator, says that you have to love your neighbor when they're acting like a neighbor. If they're not acting like your neighbor, you are not obliged to love them. Which means that I am not obliged to love the anti-Semitic Ku Klux Klan neo-Nazi who lives down the block from me. I don't really have one. I have a very pleasant block, actually. It's about 60% Orthodox Jews, and the rest of them are all faiths, and there are Muslims and Christians and people of no religion, and we get along pretty well, actually. But if I had an anti-Semitic neo-Nazi down the block, I would not be obligated to love him. That's the Rashbam, his approach to this, that there are limits to it. In other words, you can read into the text and also to practice the idea of limits here as well. Then there's the first word, which we haven't defined, which is love. And it brings up an interesting question. Oops, here go my notes. It's certainly a good question for somebody like me who works for a social service agency. I work for a Jewish social service agency. And anybody here who is in the world of the helping professions, social work, psychology, knows that there's a whole question, can you force somebody to have emotions? Can you actually force somebody to love somebody else? It's a good question. And in fact, in the world of therapy, it's not that clear, and that's usually not the route that they go when they're trying to help people transcend and overcome personal issues. And this is a question where the commentaries are divided. Does God want us to actually feel? Can we be legislated to feel emotions? It's not only here, by the way. There are other passages in the Torah which talk about being happy and rejoicing. So in the Torah reading that was read in synagogues all over the world yesterday, there is the ceremony of the first fruits, which takes place on the holiday of Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, usually in May. And the Torah says in Deuteronomy, I forget the chapter, I could look it up, but I'd be taking up your valuable time here. You shall rejoice in all the good that God has given you. You should be happy. The Sameach, you should be happy. Now, how can the Torah, or God, or any outside force tell us how to feel? So this is the subject of some dispute. There's some saying, actually, yeah, we're being told how to feel, but there is another approach. This is the approach of another early commentary, 11th century commentary called the Sefer HaChinuch, the Book of Education. We don't know the author's name, we just have the work, so I can't tell you who wrote it or where this person lived. And this work takes what we would call today a behavioral approach to it. The idea that we can't be told how to feel, we can be told how to behave. And what it means in our passage here is that you may not be able to love everybody. You do need to act in a loving manner. That is something we can be told to do. And in fact, if we continue with the social service model, the popular therapy that's used for a lot of things today is called CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And the idea is that if you get the behavior in line, then the feelings will come from that. So there may be a lead-in to that, but you start with the behavior. You behave in a loving manner. You behave in a joyful manner. You behave in a caring manner. And I have to say that the Jews of the first century knew all this. They knew all this. What Jesus did with this parable, I'm not prepared and in a position to comment on because I'm not a Christian scholar. But I can tell you, based on what I know from the Torah, that the Jews that period clearly knew this, and they were aware of this. So we're supposed to behave in a loving manner. Back to Pittsburgh for a minute. The physician, one of the physicians that treated the shooter was Jewish. And they asked him later on, how could you do that? I mean, this guy was trying to kill your people while they were praying in synagogue on Saturday morning. And his answer was, I'm a doctor. That's what I do. I care for people. Which was a very Jewish reaction based on the interpretation of this verse. And I think maybe other faiths would say, well, that could be a very Muslim or Christian reaction or Buddhist reaction as well. And I would grant that 100%. But I'm speaking from my tradition. It's certainly grounded in my own tradition. So we act in a loving manner. I'm going to close with a story. I've got 4 minutes left or 3 minutes left. This should be perfect, actually. I'm going to introduce you to another person, not a 10th century scholar and not a 1st century scholar. It's my father, of blessed memory. He's been gone about 9.5 years. My parents were Holocaust survivors. So I can speak with a little bit of authority about the experience of my people in the Second World War. This is one of my father's many, many stories. After 5 years in the Lodz ghetto, he thought things couldn't get any worse when he was deported to Auschwitz. When he got to Auschwitz, his father had been murdered by the Gestapo, beaten in the early years of the Holocaust. He was separated from his sister and his mother. He saw his mother being herded to the gas chamber, and he saw the crematoria, and I've heard this from many, many times when he was alive, and he said, I have to find a way, I have to live through this. I have to find a way to live through this. He was in a holding barracks after he saw his mother herded to the gas chamber, and then at some point, they asked for skilled engineers. They wanted engineers. They didn't say why. And he said, maybe this is my ticket out of here. So he raised his hand. My father made uniforms for the Nazis in the ghetto in Lodz. The Lodz ghetto had a lot of factories that the Nazis exploited with slave labor. But he said, maybe I can get out of here. So he raised his hand. They said, are you an engineer? He says, yes, I am. If you're not, we'll shoot you right here. He says, no, I can do this. So they took him. And they took him to, it was never clear to me where, but I think it was one of the slave labor camps that was a satellite of Auschwitz. And he knew that he didn't know the work, whatever it is they wanted. It wasn't that difficult, but he didn't know what he was doing. So he decided to get a little bit of chutzpah and ask the Meister. This particular camp was run by a German Meister, a civilian, who was head of the slave labor, but not a member of the German army and not a member of the SS. And he asked the Meister, he told him the truth, that I'm here, but I don't know how to do this work. And the Meister, as my father put it, Hot Rachmanis was the Yiddish term, he had mercy, he had pity was the word my father used. I don't like that word, but that's the word my father used. He had pity on me, and he taught me what to do. It wasn't that difficult. And not only that, he occasionally brought me a sandwich from time to time. And my father said, that's how I survived that particular camp. And my father's final remarks in this story was, even in the middle of hell, there were some good people. That story has stayed with me for a long, long time. It suggests to me that we can make a choice, even in hell, to love or act in a loving way. You can pick your interpretation, it gets us to the same place no matter how you slice it. But that it's possible to make a choice to help someone, to fulfill the words of God in the Torah, to love your neighbor the way you would love yourself. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Dr. Joseph. That's okay. We have one more speaker, and that is Abdul Malik Ryan. Abdul served as an imam of the Inner City Islamic Center and has been the Muslim Chaplain at DePaul University since 2009. We welcome you.
Thank you so much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Assalamu alaikum, and peace and blessings be upon all of you. I just wanted to say that, and I'll get into this in this talk, I think one of the most beautiful things about neighbors, and one of the most beautiful things from the Sunnah, or the way of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is issuing invitations and accepting invitations. So it's a very big thing, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace and blessing be upon him, one of the big things that he did was that he always accepted invitations. And that was big in the society that he was in, which was very conscious, much like our society, but maybe in different ways, of people's status and place. And you would accept invitations from certain people, but you would never accept invitations from people who you thought were below your station or who were below people you would visit. But the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he made it a point to always accept invitations. And so I'm grateful for the invitation to be here. And I have to say, I always feel, especially at home, I may not look like it. You know, the rabbi began with the story of the person who looks like a rabbi. I kind of look like a rabbi. A lot of people confuse me for a rabbi when they see me. But I'm actually a Muslim, chaplain and imam. Confusing everything, reality is that I was baptized as Michael Patrick Ryan. So I feel very much at home whenever I come into a Catholic space. And especially, I would say, I don't know why in today in particular, my mother passed away about 13 years ago, and I think of her, of course, all the time, but for some reason today I was thinking about her a lot. And I do remember her whenever I come into, she was the one who chose to baptize me as Michael Patrick Ryan, and she was someone like many of us, and maybe some can relate, had a complicated relationship with the Catholic Church, but was completely formed and nursed in the Catholic Church, and that was something she tried to communicate to me, even though she was, I think, never sure she really did communicate to me exactly what the Church meant to her, and why any disappointments that she had in the Church were out of her profound love for the Church and for the teachings, especially of Jesus, peace be upon him. And so in that sense, I really always feel like my coming to Islam and coming to understand both Jesus, peace be upon him, and the Catholic Church much more as a Muslim than I did when I was a Catholic, and that's a whole other story why I feel that was the case. But I do want to also begin by saying that this is, of course, visiting people's sacred houses is a very important and very beautiful thing to do. And I also like to remind myself, that this land that we're in is a sacred land, and some of us think of different lands as sacred. So in our religious traditions, we may have lands that are sacred to us. In our personal histories, we may have lands that are sacred to us. I may, from researching my family and stuff, I may consider, the western part of Ireland where my ancestors came from, that may be sacred to me because I feel that's where I'm the result of people from that place. But every land is sacred to somebody, and it was very profound. The first time I heard that was from a Native American speaker who was speaking, and she said that every land is sacred to somebody, and don't forget that. And don't forget the land that we're upon is sacred to somebody. And I also think going beyond that, without ever losing sight of that, and without ever trying to stop redressing any grievances or redressing any oppression that took place on any land that we're on, I also think that we want to say that this land too can and should become sacred to us as well. This land too can and should become sacred to us. Certainly if the land, like I said, where my great-grandfathers were born and lived, should be sacred to me, but also the land where my grandchildren will be born and live and die should also be sacred to me, and should also be very meaningful to me. So I hope that we can, I think one of the ways that we establish the sacredness of a space is through the relationship of neighbors to each other, and through the relationship, and I'll come back to this, but I think this is one of the special meanings that honoring neighbors has, is that you recognize a value in the place that you're in, and you recognize a value in your relationship with someone simply because you both live in the same space. That's the only basis of your relationship to each other, and there's some honor there. In fact, I want to say that, the Muslim tradition has its own, version of what is sometimes called the Golden Rule, of course, and it's phrased actually, the person is not a believer until he loves for his brother or sister what he loves for himself. Okay, so it's phrased in the term of brother or sister in terms of humanity. That a person doesn't have faith, is not a believer until you love for your brother or sister what you love for yourself. And we can see even in the presentation so far that the term neighbor can take on a lot of different meanings. And does neighbor just mean every other human being? Does neighbor mean, as I'm saying, something specifically of someone who lives close to you? As our beautiful presentation from the Christian speaker mentioned the neighbor is someone we meet on the journey along the way. They become our neighbor on our journey along the way, even if for a brief moment. All these are beautiful definitions, but just for the sake of not repeating other things or bringing something new to the definition, in the Islamic tradition it's really focused the concept of the actual neighbor, jar. The term neighbor in Arabic means, so if you look in the books, like when I'm preparing this, so there's a book called Riyadh al-Salihin by Imam Nawawi, who was a classical Muslim scholar who collected under different topics verses of the Quran and different stories of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and sayings. And we call this the preacher's best friend, because whatever topic you come, you just go to that and you can find the material that you could find to talk with. So if you go to that book, or if you go to Imam Bukhari, another great collector of teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, he has a book called Adab al-Mufrad, the book of manners, okay? And he has a chapter on the rights of the neighbor as well in the book of manners. So you go to these books and you'll find very similar collections of all the times that the Prophet Muhammad spoke about the neighbor and the rights of the neighbor. And so if you go through these traditions, you'll see that in that sense it focuses very especially on the actual neighbor, like the physical neighbors that live near you. And one of the things, there's a very powerful verse of the Quran. And the Quran, it says, worship God and join none with Him in worship. So this is really, if there's one message in the Quran and in the way of life of Islam, this is the main message. Okay, worship God, submit yourself to God, and don't join any partners with God. God alone, one God, Tawheed. Then it says, but then this very powerful and, the very powerful wa. So it says, worship God and don't join any partners with Him, and do ihsan, do beautiful righteousness towards. And then it names different categories of people that you have to do ihsan to. You have to do beautiful righteousness in the way that you treat them, which is more than, as we mentioned, more than just treating them the way they treat you, but is treating them well even if they treat you badly, or treating them well even if they don't deserve it, and those kind of things. Ihsan. Do ihsan to your parents first, then your kinsfolk, then orphans, then the poor, al-masakin. Then it says, the neighbor who's near and the neighbor who's far. And then it says, the companions by your side, the wayfarer, and those over whom you have power. So these are the categories that are mentioned. So these are special categories that are mentioned. And so what I like about this concept, if we look at it this way, and the other traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, is that it gives the neighbor a special value of your duty towards them above just being another human being, or above being someone else who's part of the human family. That has a very special value. That has a very special potential for relationship with anyone just because they're also a part of the human family. But the neighbor has something above and beyond that. And this concept of the neighbor who's near and the neighbor who's far has a couple of different ways. I love it. I love just how it sounds in just leaving it how it is. Most of the commentators of the Quran will say that the neighbor who's near refers to neighbors who are related to you. Neighbors who are your relatives, and then the neighbors who are far, meaning neighbors who are strangers, who are either not part of your tribe or neighbors, or even people you don't know. So, obviously in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, it would be very unusual to have neighbors that you literally didn't know. Unlike our time, people lived in smaller communities and you would know everyone who was around you. So strangers could mean just that they're not from your tribe, they're not from your group, they're not from your family, but they lived by you. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in Medina, if we envision Medina, the city of Medina where he lived, people lived close, and it was a multi-faith community and a multi-ethnic community. It wasn't just Muslims and it wasn't just Arabs. It was a diverse group of people, even for that small village in the middle of Arabia at that time of history. So the Prophet, peace be upon him, he lived literally next to the masjid. Like there was a curtain on his house that when he went out of it, he would be in the mosque, okay? So he lived literally next to the mosque. And so his neighbors were the other people who lived nearby him. And actually his closest neighbors, the Prophet, peace be upon him, his closest neighbors were then what we call Ahl al-Sufa. Ahl al-Sufa were the people who lived in the mosque. Basically the mosque was like a homeless shelter. So people who did not have a home or did not have family or just came into town, did not have wealth or job or anything, they would stay overnight in the mosque. So that they were actually the neighbors of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. They were the ones that he was close by. and he would honor their invitations when they would invite him. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, would always invite them to come share whenever food came to his house. And the Prophet would always ask if someone brought food to his house, is this charity? Are you giving it as sadaqah, charity, or are you giving it as a gift? Is it a gift to me? And if it was a gift, then the Prophet would call all the people from Ahl Sufa and they would all share the food together. And if it was sadaqah, he would call all the people from Ahl Sufa and they would just eat it. He wouldn't eat it because he didn't eat it if it was charity, only if it was a gift. But in either case, he brought the people of Ahl Sufa together and he shared a meal with them. So I found that was very powerful, the idea that the rabbi mentioned that sometimes the emotion that we're trying to get to is not where we start. We start with the actions that build the emotion. And we as Muslims believe that even in our relationship with God. Like, we don't believe you pray 5 times a day if you're in the mood 5 times a day, or if you're feeling very close to God and you're feeling the magic in the prayer. You pray 5 times a day regardless, and it's the discipline of doing that that builds your connection with God. And so, similarly, in your attitude towards the neighbor, it is these things that are encouraged to do, these things that will build your connection. So one of them is inviting and having them over and sharing food. So if you share food with people, you will naturally become closer to them, and you will start to feel closer to them. Another thing is giving gifts. The Prophet encouraged that you give gifts to your neighbor. And he stressed that you don't have to have a lot to give gifts. He stressed that if you're actually cooking food in your house, that he said just add more water to the broth and then give some to your neighbor. So this was a very powerful comment, I think, both on you don't have to be rich to give charity, you don't have to be rich to give gifts and to share with people, but also that there's tremendous blessing of God in sharing with people, and that will make the food last and go longer. And any of us who have ever shared food with people know that this is true. We know that this is true, that if you share food with people, then less will be fine for you. You don't need to worry that I have to not let my neighbors know that I'm cooking today because I need the full thing for myself. But the more people who share in the meal that you have, the more blessing will be in it. The other thing is that the Prophet Muhammad would teach us that tahaddu tahabbu, that if you give gifts, that's what causes you to love each other. And when I first heard this, I would think, when I was younger and I first heard this, I would think that it means tahaddu tahabbu. Yeah, if someone's giving me gifts all the time, I'm going to love them. Right? If someone's giving me stuff all the time, I'm going to love them. And that could be true or it could be false. But I think the actual powerful of the meaning is, if you give gifts to someone, if you're the giver, it will cause you to love the person that you're giving gifts to. And this was actually a very powerful thing that goes along with this point that we're mentioning about how love forms or how emotions form. Is that I was listening to this discussion recently, and the person was like a child psychologist, and they focused on why do parents do so much, why do they sacrifice so much for their children? And the common answer is because they love their children so much, so they do so much for them. But she said actually her research, she would tend to argue, or the way she would put it, is actually the reason parents love their children so much is because they've sacrificed so much for them. It's because they've given up everything for them. That process of sacrificing for someone and pouring everything you have into them makes you love them very much. So similarly, if we give gifts to people, even if at first it's difficult, if we give gifts to people, we will start to love them because we'll remember all the times that we sacrificed them and all the food we shared with them and all the things we did with them. In terms of sharing food, there's another powerful verse that relates to those neighbors and neighbors from different communities. We know in Islam, and this is a whole topic that we won't get into now because it would be very complicated, but there are dietary laws for Muslims as well as for other religious communities. But when God describes the dietary laws and what meat you can eat, He says the food of the people of the book, meaning Jews and Christians, is lawful for you, it's halal for you. So this is why I can eat kosher hot dogs that I get from the store. Like, even though I only eat Islamically slaughtered meat generally, but because of the food of the people of the book, I also will eat kosher meat. And the debate is about Christian meat. Is there a such thing as Christian meat? So that's what we're not going to get into today. But that's a debate. That's a debate that people have. And actually, it does show a difference between our communities, which also came out indirectly in the first presentation of how, in some sense, Christianity sees itself as a reaction against the idea of a sacred law as the way to get to God, but Islam very much is in the Jewish camp as it's following a sacred law is the way to get close to God and to connect to God. So, without taking away from any of the deeper points of spirituality and love that we're mentioning as well, which we think build from following that law rather than being opposed to it. So, but the interesting thing is that your meat is halal for you, this is permissible for you, their meat is permissible for you, but then it says your meat is also permissible for them. But of course, if I ask my rabbi friend, is like Muslim slaughtered meat permissible, he would say, not really, not likely, unless something very special is going on there. Technically we could have a Muslim, and I think there are some in different places where they try to do this. We could have someone whose purpose is to produce meat for Muslim, but they have a Jewish person come in and slaughter under supervision, so that will also be kosher. So there could be a way to do it, but it would take a lot of work to make sure. It wouldn't naturally be the case. So why is the Quran saying your meat is permissible for them? And Christians, we don't care, so they'll eat it. When it comes to do so, many scholars have said that the purpose of this, especially the second statement that your meat is permissible for them, is not to make a religious ruling in their tradition, that's up to them, but it's to encourage you that you should share food with them and you should eat together with them. That don't let the religious rulings that, again, are important in their ways about food, don't let that prevent you from eating with people just because it's too complicated to get a diet that we can fit with everybody. So may Allah reward everyone who tries to help people honor their dietary restrictions but still be able to come together and share food and share time and share companionship in powerful ways. I'm going to just mention quickly that one of the things that along these lines, one of the most famous statements that the Prophet Muhammad said about the neighbor was that he said that the angel Gabriel, Jibreel, he would visit the Prophet Muhammad. And this was one of the ways, not the only way, but one of the ways that the Prophet Muhammad would have the Quran revealed to him. Is the angel Gabriel would come and recite Quran to him. And every Ramadan, the angel Gabriel would sit with the Prophet and they would pray together and recite the whole Quran together. So he would know, okay, here's everything up till now and here's the order it is in. And because the Quran was not revealed in the order in which it is organized now, but Jibreel would tell him this is the order that it should be in. And he would also come in other times and places, and sometimes he would even come in the form of a human being, which is a very beautiful concept. And he would come in the form of, they said when he would come, he looked like one of the companions of the Prophet, one of the friends. They would think it was him, and then later on they would say, no, that was Jibreel. But he was a very handsome companion, so Jibreel would want to come in his form. And one time, the Prophet, sallallahu, peace be upon him, he apologized to Jibreel because he said when he came one time in the form of that companion, his two grandchildren, Hassan and Hussein, were like jumping on him and trying to get him. And he said, I apologize for you, but you look like Dihya Kalbi, who is this other companion, and he's someone who always gives a gift every time he sees children. He gives them a gift. So they thought it was him, so they jumped on you like that. But Jibreel would keep coming with admonitions and with advice and with answers to questions that the Prophet, peace be upon him, had from people. And he said that Jibreel kept stressing to me so much, be conscious of it from you, regardless of whether you like that family or didn't like that family. This was in the Quran. God outlines a specific inheritance. So it's not just about choosing who your favorite son is or this or that. Everyone has a specified amount based on their relationship to you. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, he said, I was sure that the next thing he was going to do was tell me which share the neighbor gets. Because he stressed so much, be careful about the neighbor. Honor the rights of the neighbor. Okay, so we will close by mentioning, as I said, what I want to say is from taking, so when the scholars talk about what is the definition of a neighbor then, if you have all these rights to a neighbor and there's something sacred about having a neighbor as opposed to just any other human being, who's a neighbor then? And some people would say, some scholars said it's 40 houses in each direction. Okay, so people live 40 houses in each direction, they count as a neighbor. Others would say it's the same, it's people in your general area. And of course these things change over time. Some would say it's everyone in your town. So the definition will change from time and place, but there should be a definition. And this is what I find, where I live, my home suburb, Homewood, that, we had a 5K race this morning for the schools. In public schools, I know there's a lot of beauty in religious schools, and you know, I have parts of my family that dedicate their life to Catholic schooling and has a profound history in this country, but I've also always find the public school to be a very powerful institution in America because it brings together people whose only connection is we live close to each other. And when I go to those things, I realize we all may be different, we all may have different ideas, but we have to come together and care about each other and work together just because we live in the same area. So I think that's the power of this idea of neighbor, and I think that's the power of this idea. The prophet, one time they say, who should I give out of my neighbors? And he would say, give it to your closest neighbor. And I think that some of the power of that is, don't choose your favorite neighbor who may live further away. Give it to the one right next to you, so you can't choose which neighbor you want to give it to, but you give it to one. As we said, the prophet, peace be upon him, was the best of neighbors, and he would answer people's things, and he would find the sacredness in going into their homes. I know in my own life as a lawyer for children, and my own experience with Iman, the Inner City Muslim Action Network, one of the most profound things that I had was going into the homes of different people who I was working with, different clients that I was working with, and it changes your relationship profoundly to go into people's homes and to be with them. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he would accept those invitations. He would go into the homes of those poor people that invited him. He would sit and he would tell them how much he loved their food, and then he would pray in the corner of their house. And I imagine for the rest of their lives they would tell everyone who visited them, do you know who our neighbor was? The Prophet Muhammad. And he came to our house and he told us how much he loved our food, and he prayed right over there. That place where we make all our prayers, that's where he prayed, and he prayed for this house. So may we each with each other, and may SWIFT continue to be a source of bringing people together who live in the same area, even if they have differences, to know each other and to become closer to God through knowing each other, and to visit each other's sacred houses and to visit each other's homes, and to continue on our journey towards God. Amen. Ya Rabbi.
Thank you very much, Chaplain Abdul Malik. I was so taken up with the speakers that I forgot to remind you about the paper and pencils. So I hope you took advantage of that, and you have questions that you would like to ask them, because we're going to take
one other announcement to make here. I'm going to do a plug for our service project. And this is to join the SouthWest Interfaith Team and volunteers for Care and Share project. You can find at your home faith communities some details on that. We are collecting toiletry items for the Rich Township Pantry. For the Rich Township Pantry. I feel like an actor, I should have said cute. The Rich Township Pantry. The location for sorting and for packing will be at the Episcopal Church of St. John, that's 2640 Park Drive, Flossmoor, Illinois. And it'll be Sunday, October 20th, from 2 o'clock to 5 p.m. And this is a good service project if you have a youth group too. If they need a project, they can sign up and help pack these items. Please though, children under 13 should be accompanied by an adult, but consider it as a service project for your youth groups. And you can contact Brian Burke over here at interfaith.swift@gmail.com. Just go to our website and the information is there. So again, we're collecting those toiletry items for the Rich Township Pantry. And again, look at your home faith communities. There might be a box or one of the flyers up there. Okay. We will be starting our question and answering here, question and answer session. First of all, we may not get to all the questions because there are quite a few, and it depends on the discussion. We have to be here by about 5:15. But don't worry, if your question's not asked, you will still be in the drawing to win one of these wonderful pencils. Okay, the first question I think is, we're going to start with, this is for all three of our representatives here, and also for one of our SWIFT representatives. What do faith-based organizations that you have worked with in Chicago that promote the idea of loving neighbors Can representatives of SWIFT also speak to what they have done to promote neighborly love? So again, what faith-based organizations that you've worked for in the Chicago area that promote the idea of neighborly love? So I'll throw it to the panel first here, and you can start. And Muhammad, we'll have you come up after.
I guess I'll go first. Yes, everybody's looking at me. You can all hear me? Is the mic close enough? This is actually a great opportunity for to use the permission I just received a minute ago from the SWIFT leadership to offer a commercial. No, seriously, he said you can actually do this. There are flyers that I have over there. I didn't get one of these lovely trifolds that some of the other faith groups have. I didn't know you were going to even do that. If I had known, maybe I would have come up with something, but they said that you can talk about the flyers. You get that, so I got the opportunity, but it's actually an answer to the question. So how did I get to this lovely invitation that you welcomed me and my colleagues here to offer this presentation? It came to me through one of our sub-organizations called HIAS. HIAS stands for Hebrew Immigration and Aid Service, but with the rebranding we've all been doing, it's now just initials. Once upon a time, HIAS helped Jewish immigrants in this country. My parents were helped by HIAS when they came after the Holocaust. There aren't a lot of Jewish immigrants coming to the U.S., but now it's Jewish people helping other immigrants who settled in this country. In fact, the HIAS director was originally on the program, Jessica Schaefer. When she looked and she said, wait a minute, an imam and a church representative, that's out of my league, but I got a rabbi guy who I can get for you. That's how I came to this invitation. But as long as, this is actually the answer to your question. So we're a Jewish organization, and how do we show love and act in a loving manner? So HIAS, this is what the flyers have. There are two sides to this. One is we can help you if somebody is having issues with immigration, is interested in green card citizenship. We offer that kind of support. And we're working with Syrian immigrants, Central American immigrants, former Soviet Union, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's no denominators to how we can help and how they come to us. And the other side is if you want to help, we have a whole volunteer program that involves mentoring and helping and supporting. We have done housing and clothing for new immigrants, refugees from the crisis in Syria, the Civil War. But I think that's also an answer to your question. That's how our organization, Jewish Child and Family Services, of which HIAS is an official part of, shows how we act in a loving manner towards people outside of our own community.
And those flyers are right here, if anybody wants them.
Please feel free to take and be in contact with us.
I can go next. I work for the Archdiocese of Chicago. We have a lot of ministries that touch on loving your neighbor. We have an active immigration ministry. We have some volunteers from that here, and I know a couple of the Catholic parishes that are involved with SWIFT are very involved with that. Of course, we have Catholic Charities, which is kind of the direct service arm of the Catholic Church. Those locations are all over the city, anywhere from food pantries and soup kitchens to senior housing, to Head Start programs and after-school programs, domestic violence shelters, really that run the gamut of how you could define neighbor and seek an opportunity to serve. We have Catholic Relief Services, which serves our neighbor overseas. So there are plenty of ways to get involved with that. And then the program that I coordinate on behalf of the Catholic Church here in Chicago is called the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, and that addresses the piece that I mentioned in my presentation about advocacy and justice. So we work primarily with organizations that are not Catholic. We partner with them because they are living out what we claim to believe around workers' rights, mental health, affordable housing, restorative justice, mass incarceration. So we have partnerships with organizations across the city that empower low-income communities to advocate and organize around those issues.
I'll give a quick shout out. I know, of course, we do a lot at DePaul University, and I know one of our big focuses for this year is ending homelessness as the focus of the Worldwide Vincentian Family. There's going to be an event coming up in December, which is like kind of a sleep out event, but it's meant to raise awareness and raise money for ending world homelessness. So you can pay attention for that, look for information on that. I know that's something we're really trying to work on. But I'll focus for another minute on the Inner City Muslim Action Network. So it was mentioned that I was the Imam of the Inner City Islamic Center for a time, and that was basically on the southwest side of Chicago under the auspices of Iman, which was an organization that started from efforts that I was involved in when I was a college student, and has now become a very well-known and recognized Muslim organization that also has branches in Atlanta and is really internationally known. But I think really a lot of what Iman has tried to do is to try to be part of this idea of neighbor and respond to issues of neighbor. So one thing, we have a health clinic in that area. We have, which was just recognized as a federally recognized health clinic, federally qualified, so that will be a big step in being able to serve a lot more people. It's been a long journey to get to that point, and we've also used arts and used many different things to combine, and it really started, some of our intentionality around being good neighbors really started through something called the Southwest Organizing Project, which started out of a group of Catholic churches on the southwest side that was really responding to, trying to respond in a conscientious way to kind of neighborhood change and making sure to create bonds of kinship and neighborhood where those were breaking down because of things that change over time. And now encompasses synagogues and Muslim organizations, Iman, and really continues to try to work closely together. If people know the southwest side of the city, there was a huge, during the foreclosure crisis, there's a huge issue of empty homes and just really need for economic opportunity and real need to make those neighborhoods vibrant again. So Iman has really tried to contribute to it, and I think it has both tried to emphasize what I did in my talk about the idea of whoever is around you is your neighbor, regardless of differences you may have with him, regardless of, in our time now, where we can kind of choose who we want to spend time with through the internet. We can choose to only spend time with people just like us and talk to people just like us and hear to people just like us. But if we go back to the idea of just having to come together with those people who are around you, and it's very powerful, but also bringing up that bigger sense of neighborhood of all the Muslims especially, and this was really following the example of organizations like Catholic organizations like JCUA, which Jewish Council of Urban Affairs, which was a big inspiration to us in how Iman developed, which is to also bring the resources and the gifts of the larger Muslim community around Chicago who may not live in that exact neighborhood, but also make them feel a relationship of neighborliness and a relationship of commitment, which is so important in a time and place where neighborhood segregation kind of prevents certain people from benefiting from those connections that being in the neighborhood has. So those are some things that I think Iman has really tried to answer this question of what does it mean to be a true and good neighbor, following the example of our other faith traditions.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to call Mohammed up here to talk as to what SWIFT has done to promote neighborly love.
Good afternoon again. So, one of the things SWIFT does is put programs together called Love Thy Neighbor. Question mark. Correct. And so I was thinking, while the question was being asked, every program that SWIFT puts out encompasses the neighborhood, encompasses our neighbors. If you recall, the question I first asked this crowd was, first timers raise your hand, and we had about 20 people raise their hand. I asked that question during every event, and thank God there's always new faces in the crowd, new neighbors to say hello to. You are now with your neighbors. So we put on 2 forums a year, bringing our neighbors together. And we get about, like we do today, 100 to 120 people all the time, thank God. We've been doing this about 15 plus years. We also have 2 dinners. We do a small home dinner. We invite our neighbors at somebody's house, about 25 people. We get 2 homes in February. Something might be at my house or at a Christian house or a Jewish house, and we go to that person's house and we break bread. We invite our neighbors. In November, we do a larger dinner, about 150 people, and we invite our neighbors. That dinner is special because in that dinner, you must register, pre-register, and we force you to sit with the other faith. So there's assigned seating. So you must sit with somebody of the Jewish faith, you must sit with somebody of the Muslim faith, you must sit with somebody of the Christian faith, and the Catholic faith, etc., etc. So we see our neighbors. We also go out to the public. Right? We attend expos. We'll have booths at expos. We've done the expo at St. Xavier College, where we interact with the college students. We've done expos, Tinley Expo, every year. In April, we do the Tinley Expo. About 5,000 people come by, and we pass out flyers, we talk to them, invite them to Swift events. Now we're going to our neighbors to say hello. Habitat for Humanity. We help build homes with our neighbors. And the one thing we find out is you must bring food with you. Just like we do today, we bring food with us. Because bring people out, let's feed them, break bread. And so we have Habitat, we have our home dinners, we have public forums, we do picnics for the kids. It's a great picnic. Every June or July, we'll have one big picnic, and we bring the kids out. And we have clowns, and we have jumpies, and we barbecue, and we just have a great time. Bring our neighbors out together. Always new faces, it's a blessing. So that's how Swift promotes their neighbors. That's how Swift promotes this topic, bringing forums as well. So log on to Swift, join our email list, come back again, and bring your neighbor with you next time. Thank you.
And if you didn't sign in on the way in, please sign in on the way out today.
Thank you, panel and Mohammed, for those answers. This next question is specifically for Imam Ryan. So I'm going to throw this back. It kind of ties into what you were talking about just a second ago. Can you speak to how the next generation views this idea of neighbors, specifically your students at DePaul? Can you kind of describe that?
That's a good question. I do think, and this is something I alluded to just now, but I plan to even talk about more in my talk, was I do think that changes in society have made the relationship of neighbors a lot looser than maybe has been at other times and places. I know even myself, I grew up, maybe part of it is what age you are, I guess. Like as a kid, I knew all the other kids on my block. I knew everyone in my neighborhood. As an adult, that's not necessarily true, and I'm telling on myself now that I'm probably a better speaker than doer about things. I don't know everyone that lives on my block. I don't, I do think that there's a tendency to kind of, which is a great gift for many people who have felt alone, or, and this is true among younger people too, few people who feel alone or outcast or different, that they can go online and find other people who share interests like them, or who are like them, or who affirm who they are, and I think that is a beautiful gift. But the flip side of that is that sometimes if you don't force yourself to, sometimes you don't develop those relationships with the people who are physically close to you, or the people you don't choose. I find a beautiful thing, on one hand, something that seems in our time, weird. I find when students come and they live on campus, and they just get stuck randomly with like a roommate. And on the one hand, and especially in our time, that seems weird that you would be forced to live with like a complete stranger. In the most intimate, like these rooms are small rooms, and you're forced to live in the most intimate, and many people have a huge problem with that because they have like roommate problems are something that happens a lot with people. But I always think that there is actually a tremendous gift in that, and unless there's problems of one person really disrespecting or dishonoring or oppressing the other, which as the Rabbi alluded to is an important context in all of this, that how we address oppression of others is a very important thing to address. But one thing we know is, regardless of how we talk about or how we choose to address, is that all our faith traditions teach us to stop the oppression, not to act in ways that would accommodate it or continue to go. So, having said that, I think unless there's oppression going on, like just having the discomfort of living with someone new, I know my own experience, there was a lot of growth in that. So I find that more broadly with young people, that kind of encouraging them to be open to that kind of discomfort of talking to people who may say things they find troubling, who may say things they disagree with, who may have radically different perspectives. Like, again, as long as you're safe and no one's being oppressed, that there's tremendous room for growth in those conversations. So we want to continue to encourage those type of things. We do that here among adults, but we see that there's not a lot of young people here. I don't know why that is. I mean, there's a lot of different reasons for why that is. But we do find on campus that young people do benefit from discussions like this, and do benefit from talking to people who are different than them. And maybe just the way you frame things, or or the way you talk about things has to be a little different. But I think now more than ever, and among young people especially, there's a need to bring together the idea of neighbors and communities that, like I said, go beyond people who share your faith or share your background, but are just people who are around you and people who affect each other and forming a community in that sense.
Thank you. This next question is for all three of you, and this kind of ties into not feeling comfortable maybe with your neighbor. In today's society, we kind of hear this. Neighbors naturally can mean immigrants. Can any of you speak to our collective duty to the immigrant community?
I'll jump in to start, but I'm thinking about the question is an interesting question. The collective duty. That's a big and broad question, and since we're not supposed to talk about politics here, that was made very clear in the introduction, we need to find a way to stay away from that to respect the SWIFT guidelines here. For me, it's personal. My parents were immigrants. They came, my mom came in the middle of World War II as a 12-year-old refugee on a ship that Eleanor Roosevelt and the Quakers and the Unitarians had raised money to rescue children from Europe, called the Circle of Pins. It's very well documented. My father came after being in the camps and being in the DP camps in 1949 to Belleville, Illinois. So is there a collective responsibility? Without getting into the political issues, I would like to think that America, and I assume that's what we're talking about, it's a global question, unless I misunderstood the question, is a country of immigrants, and that immigrants have enriched this country in innumerable ways. And I'm proud that my parents played their own little role in that as well. So in that sense, I think we do have a responsibility to immigrants. Bringing it down more to the local level, I think we have a responsibility to help those who've come in and cast their lot in with the rest of us Americans, and that means helping. That means this, okay? And the other points that you heard from Catholic Charities and from what Iman and the other programs that my colleague is working on. So yeah, that's where I would start. There's probably more to say, but I'll hold it right there.
Yeah, I think the important point there is acknowledging that there is a collective duty. I mean, the Bible is very clear on this. Welcome the stranger, right? Throughout the Bible, in many different shapes and forms. We know that Jesus was a refugee at least one point in his life when he was fleeing from persecution. I think where the political comes in is how do we respond, right? How do we live that out? And there are lots of different ideas about that, lots of different bills and proposals and measures. But I think the important thing is that what we can do is advocate on behalf of those immigrants. It's provide that direct service that they need to make sure that they are able to have a decent life in terms of housing, in terms of education, in terms of legal services and that sort of thing. And that we can advocate for their rights as human beings, right? There are inalienable rights, we believe that as Americans, and that we have to see that first and foremost, is the human dignity of all these people no matter where they were born. And I alluded to Catholic social teaching earlier. We have specific documents around the treatment of immigrants that can get political at some times, but I think as everyone here probably agrees, there is a collective duty in a response to the common good, and I think that's a good place to start.
I would just quickly add, I also, my own experience in becoming Muslim was primarily through the African American Muslim community. So there's a very strong African American Muslim community here in the United States, those were the people that I knew and learned about first, and that's how I came to Islam. But once I became part of the Muslim community, I also realized that, as the rabbi mentioning of it being very personal, that the majority of Muslims in America are children or immigrants or the children of immigrants. My wife is an immigrant from Pakistan. So our community is an immigrant community. I know the Catholic community is increasingly an immigrant community. I know the Jewish community has done a good job historically in America of identifying and seeing itself, remembering itself as an immigrant community and a friend of immigrants. So I think what I wanted to say by saying that is I think the narrative that we tell about ourselves is very important, and the narrative that we tell about who we are as people and who this country is very important. And I think there are always people and forces that are willing to kind of try to get you to tell a narrative about yourself that separates yourself from other people and that makes you not have to help other people. And I think we see that in immigration. We see that in kind of narratives of people like people who maybe share a similar history to me, talking a lot about how my family came here legally, you know, at a time when there were no immigration laws, basically, especially for people from Europe. So what does that mean to say my family came here legally, and now I want to turn out these people? So again, it's an important thing to really, what I found is that when I got in touch with the full breadth of the Muslim community and where, coming from all over the world and their experience in their home countries and in migrating here, is that I began to look back at my own history and see my own life and my own history in a different way than I had before. And I feel that that kind of thing, that kind of power of telling a story about yourself in a way that connects you with people who at first appear to be strange and the stranger, lies at the heart of all our traditions, of course starting with the Jewish tradition of really not trying to separate yourself. That person's a stranger, so I don't owe anything to them, but seeing yourself in common with them because you were once a stranger.
I just want to add one point. I think it's important to note, in context with everything you've heard from all three of us, that I need to know two communities, as if we're going to be inclusive, as we should be. The African American community, who did not come here to seek their fortune or to flee persecution. They were brought here enslaved as a form of persecution. And so that doesn't fit the other paradigms we have. And let's not forget Native Americans, who were here before any of us or our ancestors were here. And yet when we're talking about inclusiveness, we need to widen the boundary of inclusiveness to include those in other communities who may not fit the other parameters based on immigration that we mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I think that's so important, and whenever we even use phrases like a nation of immigrants, it's great that we mention that so we don't make people feel they're being ignored or their history is being wiped out. And one of the things I find beautiful and inspiring in knowing those communities is that I've never once, and I haven't heard everyone, but I've never once heard someone from the African American community or the Native American community who was the anti-immigrant voice trying to keep other people out. It's always people who actually are immigrants who now all of a sudden want to keep other people out. So that tells us something. Yeah.
Thank you. We're almost out of time. This will be the last question. I don't know if you can answer this quickly or how you'll respond, but it says, how do you handle difficult neighbors? So we'll end on that one.
I'll start just so I can be a little superficial and get over with. No. No, but I did want to say, and this may be the first step, and that's why when I say superficial, I mean maybe the first step, and this comes out very strongly in our tradition, is the first step of being a good neighbor is not to harm your other neighbors. So even if you can't be the person who's doing everything, is to be a person that focuses on not harming others. You know, very profound. And then the next step is doing little things that don't hurt you, but just are nice kindnesses to pay to people. And these are both explicitly in the example of the Prophet Muhammad and in the Quran itself, where first it talks about someone came to the Prophet Muhammad and they asked, we know of this one woman, and this goes to a stereotypical character that may be in many of our religious communities, you know, that we may have love for, but the Prophet here gives a very kind of harsh thing. Like it says that we know this woman she prays all night. She stands in the night in prayer. She fasts every day. She gives a lot in charity. But she harms her neighbors with her tongue. She likes to gossip about people. She likes to talk about people. And maybe even here in mentioning all the great things she does, maybe we get a hint that maybe what we have is a huge danger, a spiritual arrogance, that she thinks she's better than other people who don't do that. So it makes her talk about and feel free to harm her neighbors around her because maybe she feels a little superiority. They said, what do you say about that person? And the Prophet Muhammad, he said, there's no good in her. He literally said, there is no good in her. And then they said, there's another woman and the prophet would not, that's a very rare thing for the prophet to say that, you know, and obviously he wasn't talking, they were talking about a generic case, he wasn't talking about a specific person, but the harshness is there of that. They said there's another woman who, she only does the obligatory prayer, she doesn't do anything more than that, and she maybe gives something if she has extra in charity, but she doesn't do more than that, but she makes sure to never harm any of her neighbors. And the prophet said she's one of the people of the garden of Jannah. She's one of the people of the garden. So, again, I think the example, especially knowing who the prophet was talking to among people who were very religious and pious, as we all try to be, is that if your piety and your relationship with God does not come out in how you treat other people, then there's a problem in it. There's a falseness in a relationship with God. And that if your relationship with God is a real, true connection, it will show in how you treat other people. And so I would say that I would definitely look to continue pushing myself, regardless if I have a difficult neighbor, to try to find good. There's a famous story, I'll just allude to it. There's a famous story that Muslims tell, which we don't really know it's not in the main books of hadith, but it's probably one of the most famous stories that Muslims tell about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So I don't know exactly where it originated or where it traces to, but it tells about the idea we have of the Prophet Muhammad, at least, is that he had a neighbor who used to throw garbage on him. And we know there were people who used to do that to the Prophet Muhammad. They were against him because of the message that he was saying, and they thought he was spreading trouble and stuff like that. So she used to throw garbage on his path and at him as he went by. And then one day, there was no garbage on his path when he was walking by. So what did he do? The Prophet, he went to her house and knocked on her and said, you know, I didn't find any garbage today, so I was worried about you. I wanted to make sure you were okay. You know, so this is the example, as we said again, and maybe the Rabbi can touch on it more. It does pose a difficult question that I think all of our traditions on one level teach us to not just treat people as they treat us, but to try to treat people better than they treat us. But how do you do that in a difficult neighbor? We have to define what we mean by difficult neighbor. How do you do that without enabling oppression or without belittling yourself or your own dignity? How do you do that in a way that raises your own dignity? And I think we see that in the example of the Prophet there, that he was raising his own dignity and the dignity of that woman by saying that they had a relationship, even if based on her harm of him. And so similarly, that's what I would try to do, is try to find connections with people and try to do good with people. And I don't do a good job of it, but I find that inspiration, that I don't want to be one of those people who's hypocritical in my actions.
Sorry, that was beautiful, thank you. I'm going to add just two very short vignettes. As the question was being asked, and as my colleague Iman was talking, I was very hard pressed to think of times where I had difficult neighbors as an adult. In fact, I can think of the block that I'm on right now, and I'm thinking back to a teenager named Muhammad who lived down the block from me, who helped turn our lights on when we forgot to turn them on a Saturday. I think they've sold the house, he's not there, but he was a very lovely person, and we had a nice relationship. The best example I can give, and I have to go really far back into my childhood, when my parents first moved to St. Louis. They got married after the war, and they settled in a suburb called University City. And the troublesome neighbor was actually another Jewish family that lived right next door. And neither of us were particularly observant, but my parents were very heavily Jewishly cultural, Yiddish speaking, things like that. And this next door family kind of thumbed their nose at us. My sister and I still talk about it. They thumbed their nose, they kind of really looked down upon us. And what did my parents do? They role modeled for us. They basically treated them with kindness and with as much respect as they could muster. They didn't argue with them or react to them. They had enough of that in their lives earlier. And that's the example my sister and I as young children saw growing up. Treat people with respect and with kindness, do what you can. And eventually they came around. Eventually they lived for a long time, and they're not alive anymore. My mom sold the house after my dad died. But I think that's the application, the app for the story that you said earlier.
From personal experience, I'm struggling with this right now. I have a neighbor who lives above me who, for whatever reason, is pacing back and forth in her apartment between the hours of 3 and 4 a.m. And has a really annoying dog. And so this is one where it's been 9 months. And I think I go through phases where my reaction really reflects how I'm feeling inside. Sometimes I can completely ignore it. I've got my fan on, I don't even notice. And other times, because of whatever is happening elsewhere in my life, it just really gets to me. I think of storming up there at 3 a.m., pounding on the door, saying, "What do you think you're doing?" I'm avoiding it right now. I'm trying to find inner peace and think about what is so agitating about it and how do I resolve those pieces of my life so that I'm not responding in anger. I don't know that that's a particularly Christian response, that's just what I'm working on. But I struggle with this a lot. I am sort of in a standoff with my mom right now because we got into a fight about immigration. And I was feeling like I was being a good Christian by speaking my beliefs and by kind of standing up for the least of these, as we are taught to do. And as I was reminded by my father later, in doing so, I was disrespecting my mom. And I was not willing to dialogue and to see things the way that she sees them, and to try to understand the context in which she grew up and the experiences that she's had in her life, and kind of meet her where she is in a loving way. And I'm in a social justice study group at my church, and we went through in the first meeting kind of some expectations for dialogue and ways to treat each other and to kind of embark on this journey together. And one of them that really hit me was that the way that you treat others is more important than any opinion that you have or being right. And I just kind of saw that and I went, oh my gosh, I was so wrong. And so I'm working on reconciling with my mother, who has sacrificed so much for me and has loved me so much. And so I still don't have an answer to that question. I think it's a daily struggle for all of us, but I think trying to meet people where they are, keep in mind their context, being patient, and there was one other thing and I'm forgetting it, but really making sure that we're treating people with respect, despite those opinions that we may disagree on, and always coming back into what we have in common, which is love.
Imam Ryan, Rabbi Ozarowski, and Ms. Young, thank you very much for participating in our
For closing remarks, we'll invite the Jewish co-chair, Ernie Radis. Ernie?
Good start. Interesting program today. I think if nothing else, it opened all our eyes to a lot of similarities and a lot of thoughts that deal with neighbor and how we approach neighbors. You know, the first Swift event I ever attended sort of made the point to me that we are, in a sense, all neighbors. I was sitting at a table. It was one of the dinners, you know, where we all sit at tables and discuss the subject. And I'm sitting next to somebody, and okay, I'm Jewish, he's Muslim. We start talking. All of a sudden, I realized we're different, and we didn't agree on everything, but we were really much the same. I came from California, he came from California. I told him, well, my parents were immigrants, and you know, there was a trilingual family. You know, they told me to speak English, but they spoke Yiddish and Polish. And he told me, well, his family, they told him to speak English, but they spoke among themselves French and Arabic. They came from Morocco. And it sort of drove home, all of a sudden, that we're all not, we may be different, but we're similar, you know, and that has sort of stayed with me. So I just had to have that thought, you know. One of the things that I think has come out of this discussion, and I think all three of the people that we have here who made presentations express that, is that they sort of brought out what it means to be a neighbor and what it means to be neighborly. And I think that's a valuable concept. So I want to thank them for that, and I think we should all thank them for that. Well, since we talked about thanking, I want to thank our speakers. Let me start with. Let me see. I want to make sure that I give the right one to the right person. To our Christian speaker. Okay. And there's some. And then. Okay, this is a little complicated. I do have a certificate for the Jewish speaker, except it's not for the one that's here. but you can have it if you want it.
Jessica. I can give it to Jessica.
You can give it to Jessica, yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Hiding the names.
But the third one is correct. So I want to thank our DePaul, because I'm a DePaul graduate. And certainly last but certainly not least, I want to thank St. Michael Parish for having this event at their site and doing everything that was necessary to pull it off. And I do have a certificate.
And we want to thank all of you for being here with us and invite you to come back another time.
That's right. And I think this was a very worthwhile get-together.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I guess we're done then. Oh, you can.
Thank you so much.
Sure, okay.
I did.
Sister Meryl, can I just get a picture with you? Can I take a picture for our Hey, Brian, you know how to turn that off? What? Yes, I can turn it off. It's coming in the video. Go to the website. Okay, come on. What are you doing? Here you go, one more time. I'm done. Oh,